What is the definition of a cult, and why is Mormonism considered a cult? Great question. A cult is a difficult thing to define, but essentially, a cult is a group of people that tries to exert an excessive amount of control for a very specific, often sinister purpose. A cult can be as few as two people, a leader and a follower, and there are many common signs as to determine whether or not you are in a cult or you are witnessing a cult in action. There are many different signs to a cult. Usually, there is a central authority or figurehead who controls the cult itself, and usually it's difficult to question them or it's highly discouraged to do so. Another common sign of a cult is a gradual process of isolation from outside influences so that you are easier to control. This could happen in many different ways. This can be a cult telling you to no longer talk to your family anymore because they're considered toxic personalities or negative influences. This can be telling you to no longer read specific books because they're considered demonic in nature, or to no longer listen to certain news sources because they are enemies of your cult leader or your belief system as a whole. This process can take a long time, but essentially it can get to the point where you are so entrenched and intertwined with a cult that leaving it is essentially infeasible. For instance, if you've cut off your entire family, if you've invested all of your money into a religion, if you've no longer pursued educational interests, so therefore you're not employable, if you leave this cult, ultimately you would be homeless, you would be on the streets, and most people don't want to do that. I've said this before and I want to reiterate that it is not a mark on your intelligence or lack thereof if you join a cult. There are smart and educated people who fall for cults as well. There are vulnerable people who fall for cults. But when it comes to Mormonism, why do so many people, in some ways myself included, consider Mormonism to be a cult? One of the main reasons why Mormonism is considered a cult is because of the gradual centralization of authority by Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith started the church in 1830, and during that time when it first started, everyone was allowed to receive revelations, and they would often do speaking in tongues. That is the reason why Brigham Young joined. He was part of the Second Great Awakening. He saw them speaking in tongues, and he wanted to be a part of that. However, Joseph Smith made it so that only he could actually receive revelations from God. Therefore, only the prophet of the church could receive revelations, which so happens to be the most powerful person in the church. The seizure of power by Joseph Smith was met with resistance during his time. It was not a natural progression. It was a deliberate series of actions by Joseph Smith to have more control over the Mormons. For instance, not only did he control revelation, but he also made several predictions that didn't come true, and then he tried to cover them up later on, such as predicting the second coming of Christ in his generation, predicting that there would be a temple in Independence, Missouri in his generation, and also predicting the death of Lilburn Boggs by violence by the end of 1842. None of that which came to pass. Not only that, but Joseph Smith also controlled the finances of the church. He also had his critics fined, excommunicated, and jailed if they spoke out against him. He denied practicing polygamy for years until John C. Bennett became so apparent in his practice of polygamy that he had to have him excommunicated from the church because John C. Bennett told people that Joseph Smith endorsed his practice of plural marriage. John C. Bennett was also the mayor of Nauvoo, Illinois, and Joseph Smith himself became the mayor, giving him more power over the city government. Smith also ordered the destruction of the printing press of the Nauvoo Expositor in 1844 after it published articles accusing him of practicing polygamy. Now, when I tell people this, I typically hear that Joseph Smith was human, just like the rest of us, and he made mistakes because we're not infallible. But Joseph Smith's actions were not accidents. They were incredibly deliberate towards seizing power and avoiding accountability, both highly indicative signs of a cult leader. The fact that he openly denied practices that he was doing, such as plural marriage, for so long is highly indicative of a cult leader as well. The fact that he made it so that only he could receive revelations from God, binding revelations, mind you, yet he would contradict his own revelations or attempt to correct them in order to avoid accountability, again, is highly indicative of a cult leader who is trying to control the flow of information to their followers. Now you might be wondering, well, if Mormonism is a cult, why didn't it just die with its leader? Well, not all cults do. When Joseph Smith is murdered in 1844, he's viewed as a martyr, and this often makes cults stronger. However, there is a fracturing in the Mormonism movement. You have different groups like the Strangites, as well as the Bickertonites, as well as the Cutlerites, as well as the RLDS. And eventually, the mainstream LDS movement, led by Brigham Young, the leader of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, moves to Utah, where they're able to grow their numbers over time. So Mormonism was able to persist because of its structure. However, it is considered a cult by many people, specifically because of how much control Joseph Smith attempted to assert over his followers, to the point of where he determined theology, finances, civil duties such as being the mayor of Nauvoo, military actions such as Zion's camp, and eventually to the point of where he was trying to silence his own critics through any means necessary. Those are very large signs indicating that something is a cult.